Hey guys, Alex Williamson here with the secret history inside of your fish tank. Today I will be talking about the Czech Republic and why it is the #3 exporter of tropical fish in the hobby. Now, there's some interesting history that has to go into this, and I'm not trying to claim that everyone's experience in the Czech Republic was the same or that this is the way it is everywhere. This is just some generalizations and some factors that I've looked at and really think may have shaped the hobby. So, first off, the Czech Republic as it stands today is located dead smack in the middle of Europe, and it is the #3 exporter, only behind Japan and Taiwan or Singapore, of tropical fish for the pet trade. So, one of the reasons is as you can see, it is landlocked, and it is only a day or so drive to any given country in Europe, which positions them for a great to have a great standing. So half of the fish coming into the Czech Republic nowadays is from Southeast Asia or South America, other places, and then often they're line bred or refined there. Or bred there, but a lot is still coming in and then going out, with that being a hub. It's almost like a port city that's landlocked, if you will. Fish travel a lot better sometimes by ground or by post rather than like overseas on planes and things like that, getting lost in the mail. So it's got a good position for that. So moving on through the history, this is the Czech Republic as we know it today, surrounded by Germany, Poland, Slovakia from back when it was Czechoslovakia, and then Austria below. So if we continue on, the Czech Republic and Prague and a lot of the great cities are located there. It's a very European country. It's kind of where East meets West, and Prague is probably considered the westernmost capital of Europe, or the easternmost capital of European culture, I would say. Arguably, people might say that somewhere in Poland or in Russia might also be an argument for that, but I think for intents and purposes, we're going to call it the farthest eastmost capital. So it's a beautiful country. It escaped bombing during World War I and II for the most part, but it was occupied. And now it has become known for beautiful fish. So things like discus and, beautiful epistogramme. It's just a gorgeous producer of fish. If you can see here, these are some varieties coming out of the Czech Republic. Also killifish, also well known there. And I just wanted to kind of touch on that because this may not be the best view, so I'm going to kind of fiddle with things so that you can see. Moving on, early on in Czech history, we had aquariums kept in the 1800s by naturalists and kind of the elite in the country. And, they had these legs here that were really ornate oftentimes. They also had like podiums and pillars that were made that way. And then they also had ponds. And they had everything from naturalist societies that collected birds to plants to all sorts of things. And it was really a hub of culture for Germanic and also Balkan and even Mediterranean aristocracy. A lot of people would come into Prague and they would trade fish and stories and education. And as time went on, they began to even keep salt water early on. Oftentimes this didn't work out so well. They didn't know how to kind of balance everything, and the early take on tanks was to kind of put whatever you found at the beach in it and then cycle out water that was salt added to it, and things just didn't kind of work out in that respect until much later, and now they are great at it. So even early on, the Czech Republic has had an affinity for fish. It's not that they consume that much fish. In fact, they don't consume that much fish compared to other European countries, but they've always had traditions involving carp and other fish that are pretty interesting for hundreds of years. Now, one of them happens to be, you might have heard of, is the Christmas carp, and that's when they keep carp in their bathtub as a place to hold it until Christmas. Also, a lot of times carp come in mucky, and that kind of cleans them off and everything. And then our equivalent of a ham or a turkey or something like that, they stuff the carp with chestnuts and have roasted or broiled carp or fried. I guess it depends these days. It's kind of one of those old traditions that I don't know if everyone loves it, but some of my Czech friends certainly don't. But it still goes on, and there's Christmas markets, and people bring home a big old Christmas carp and keep it in their bathtub. So that's just another little tidbit about fish and Czechoslovakia. So now moving on to World War II and World War I. So World War I, to start off right before this map, the Czech had a pretty renowned military, and they had marched all the way into Vladivostok on the far side of Russia. They had helped out Russians during the White Russian era, and when the Tsar was in power, they helped the Tsars with their troops. And then all of a sudden, when the Bolsheviks took over, they found themselves in hostile territory, and near 100,000 troops had to make their way back into Czechoslovakia, with them forming ties with other Russian people and also a sense of Russian culture. So now, later on in the 30s, 20s and 30s, after a lot of Europe was decimated by World War I, you know, some of the Western countries had a third of their young men killed in the war. Later on, they kind of were spared some of that pain, in that they became, in Prague in the West, a big cultural center. And, you know, in Pilsen, they've obviously got all sorts of beer and, you know, things that you'd think of as Czech culture, lovely people, hospitable people, and there was a bit of a renaissance there. Now, later on, 1938, during the Munich Pact, Italy, Germany, France, and notably the UK decided to give Hitler this land here, which was known as the Sedating Land, and that's the land surrounding current day and former at the time when it was Czechoslovakia, and you can see there's a comparison to the size of Florida here. They had to give up that land because the Western powers thought that that concession would stop Hitler. Little did they know that didn't stop Hitler at all. That was the first of his Lebensraum plan, which was expanding Germany. And by 1945, the whole country was enveloped. From 38 to 45, more and more Hitler grew in his power. And by the end of 1945, a resistance formed, and they also used their communist allies in the Soviet Union, who came in from the east, while the Allies came in from the west, pushing them out. And it ended up that they stuck with those communist ties more than with the Western ties. So in 1945, they started a socialist communist government. There's different names for it, but essentially it was a not quite as harsh as Soviet communism, but still pretty communist or socialist in ideology. And later on, in the 1950s, a lot of people began to have free time and raise fish. So fish were a hobby all over the world. It was kind of seen as, I guess, a luxury or kind of exciting or exotic to have fish from these far-flung places that 10, 20 years ago, before World War II, nobody had seen, whereas during World War II, Americans and Westerners and Germans, all sorts of people ended up connecting with one another, both violently and as in allies for peace, and they ended up seeing and bringing back all sorts of curious fish and specimens and culture and ideas. And by the by the 1960s, after these fish clubs had popped up and fish were popular in ponds and in gardens, not just the elite class as in the 1800s had fish, but everyone started having fish, and they were being imported from all over the world through government channels, and it was seen that it was a good hobby that kept people entertained and happy, and it wasn't a hobby that was a danger to the state. But by the 1960s, Czechoslovakia became, here's another, really quickly, here's another map of the boundaries from 1938 to 39 and how much they changed when they were German and then kind of just contested over Czechoslovakia, USSR, Hungary. There was kind of a mess there for a while, and the country was in peril. So, as you know, there's Hitler making the deal. Later on, when the Soviets moved in, they constructed these monoliths to communism. In 1968, on August 21st, the Soviets invaded, and they decided that they were going to clamp down on this liberal form of communism that had become prevalent. You know, people were listening to music and getting a little bit more Western and having a little bit of pocket money to trade. Even though the state ran and owned things, people were using fish amongst many other things to trade with one another and have some spending money as a hobby. In an American fish magazine, which this could be slanted, they stated that in 1950, over 800 species of fish were in the country, and over 3,000 registered breeders were in the country. And that could range from someone's house or in a basement or in a community center. And as I've been told, and I wanted to correct from the first video, oftentimes these weren't necessarily just in an apartment building, but they were in allotted space given to people by the government. Because if you were playing with fish, so to speak, you weren't out writing anti-communist manifestos and things. This is a picture from 1968 when the Russians came in, and there was quite a bit of bloodshed. After the Russians secured their grip on the area, there were a lot of people disappearing, there were some people executed, and things got a lot more strict. As well into the late 60s and 70s, the fish were still there and part of the culture, and they were proud of them, but they put them into public places. So in the town, for instance, of Rekšnov nad Knedznou, and I'm so sorry I said that completely wrong, I'm sure, there were expos, and later on that's where the fish convention would be every year, and starting in the 70s, every year they've had like an exposition of fish there, and over 200 species are there, and they're judged, and the communist government really focused on not having people selling fish per se, but if they went through the proper government channels, then it was seen as a good thing. Like, they're going to raise fish, they're not going to raise hell. So you see things like artwork on their stamps that have fish. You see the carp there. This is a 1966 piece of art that's showing kind of the more liberal. That's not a traditional Soviet style satellite, even though they're a Soviet satellite state. That's not the typical art that you would see, that kind of known communist propaganda art that was very realist. This has a little more flair. It's watercolor. So just kind of interesting that their stamps, you know, they prided themselves on their fish. Back to the troubled times of the brotherly incursion by the Soviets, who basically stepped in. There was a lot of political unrest there. There were people who wanted to say that they were communists and socialists, but they didn't want to take it as far as the Soviets. There was a lot of strife, and the fish hobby kind of had to take a hold go on hold and go underground a bit. So after the Soviets take hold, you start seeing these monolithic buildings known as like block houses or block towers in the West, as we call them. And a lot of times people said that those things were kind of drab, small. Now, housing was free. There's no homelessness. The government, if you had a job, which everyone did, you had a place to live. But that being said, you didn't have spending money necessarily. If you did, it was what are you going to buy, because the state owns everything. And so things that you could create became more popular. So you can create fish, you can breed new types of fish, and things like military visits from Russia into Africa, into Southeast Asia, supporting the Vietnam War, supporting Angola, Ethiopia in the 70s, all sorts of proxy wars sprung up. And those Soviet troops and scientists happened to be scouting the world for new and interesting things because they weren't trading with the West, they weren't getting information from the West or the world as a whole, and people weren't allowed to leave. And so bringing them a little bit of exotic, interesting stuff like fish or birds or lizards was another way to kind of appease people. So even though there was this strife afterwards, they went back into really pushing people to, you can see here this densely packed block housing that appears a little drab, and people want nature in their lives, just like in Seattle. I mean, there's condos, or Manhattan, there's houses and just buildings upon buildings of people everywhere, and that ends up taking a toll on you, especially when it's snowy. You might want a little bit of light, a little bit of warmth, a little bit of beauty in your house. And so a lot of times these apartment blocks in their basement would set up a community center or in their neighborhood, and they would then take care of fish on a hobby level. So moving on, you can see another day in the 70s in Soviet-influenced Czechoslovakia. All the cars kind of look the same. Now, if you wanted a car, I was told a story by a friend now, a new friend on Facebook who lives in Czechoslovakia, or in the Czech Republic, pardon me, currently, and he was saying that, his grandfather bought a car with fish, and he used fish as a commodity in the sense that he raised bits of money from it and ended up getting good at raising fish. And because you couldn't buy Western goods, as you can see here, there's no Western cars. It's the same car, essentially, all down the street. You end up with only Soviet-made stuff from the Warsaw countries, the Warsaw Pact countries. And so only Eastern Bloc things made it into the country. And that meant that, high-tech hydroponics and aquariums and fish gear were not on the top of their list necessarily. Now, they would do that for public expos and things, but you needed a permit, or you needed to know somebody who knew somebody to get these kind of rare things. And smuggling was hard in the country, but people did smuggle things in and out of the country and trade for things like, Western records or Levi jeans, things like that. Same thing happened in Russia and other Soviet countries. But later on, those scientists and Russian soldiers, who later became civilian scientists and things, began to implement all sorts of agricultural programs. And in Czechoslovakia, it was no different. So they began things like growing indoors, hydroponics, and these people also took that knowledge and brought it back home. So because food was rationed, people also had these gardens, and they had community gardens where they would get a slip or an allotted space, and they would grow food, and they would grow flowers and things like that, and they could either eat that and supplement their other food, which may be like rice and bread and things that aren't necessarily seen as a luxury, whereas like coconuts or citrus, things like that, were only at Christmas time or during the holidays, and the holidays, like church and religion, was frowned upon. So it became an incentive to learn how to grow it indoors. And while the state worked on it, individuals also worked on it. And here you can see a late 70s expo on fish. This is a planted tank. You can see that they didn't have the glass set up, but they've got like a koi pond or something, I'm assuming, going on there. Here was another picture sent to me. Hard to see, but fish tank, fish tank, fish tank, fish tank, fish tank, fish tank. And these were 1970s do-it-yourself gatherings of clubs and things, and they would take like old windows, and they would take old batteries from cars, and they would take all sorts of ingenuity. These people were really, really worked with what they had, and it was pretty amazing what they were able to do. Here's another photo of one of these clubs. You know, they've got pictures of the fish on the wall. They've got their tank set in a cabinet and all lit. They're also, you can see they've got their plants indoors, which is also kind of ahead of its time to be trying to grow things indoors like that. And then we also have here, this is an example of a community garden. So the community garden, you had a shed, and then maybe there'd be 50 people that shared this, and they each get a plot of land and they can grow whatever they want. And that helps supplement the lack of fresh produce or tropical produce. Maybe there's a short season, you can grow something. And also in these gardens were ponds and things like that where people would raise fish. One of the other things that they were known for is raising things like corridores or corridoras or plecos and things like that. Catfish, carp, things that could survive outside. They have harsh winters, but you can, if you do it right, you can raise certain fish outside or move them inside for half the year, spawn them, sell them, you know, and then move on. But right now, this is a current listing that I saw of some quarries that were available through the Czech Republic, and it just blows my mind the selection that they have. So it's come a long way. Same with the Apistogrammae azizii, like double fire red, double reds, all sorts of different kinds have been specialty bred. And starting, you know, with in the 70s, the expositions and the Rekňav nad Nietzau now, sorry guys, I'm really butchering that. A town that has the fish convention every year. Also, there are every month somewhere in the country there is a fish gathering, whether that's for live bearers or for cichlids or whatever, but it's a big part of the culture. And according to a 1996 census, 40% of Czech people had someone in their house with a fish tank, so they were living in a house with someone who kept fish, which is way higher than the rest of Europe. Modern day Czechoslovakia, as we've transferred towards the 80s, you start seeing more buildings like this. It looks pretty typical to a Western building. Down in the basement here, this happens to be an actual fish, a small or micro fish room where people are growing and breeding fish. Now, some elderly couples happen to live upstairs. I was reading an article written by a great Scottish paper or blogger, and I'll link to his stuff also. But he took a visit here. He wasn't expecting this. He said it was cold outside, and he walks into the basement and it's humid, and there is all sorts of stuff set up. So there's, you know, everything from modern day stuff set up to in the apartments, some people have breeding going on at this level. They have hydroponics going on, you can see. And just, you know, it's bringing a lot of light and life into the house. And rather than using natural sunlight or having a dog that takes up a lot of resources when maybe money was tight in the Soviet era, you get these clubs where you can do this. And the state actually began to really see it as a moneymaker, and also they saw that people were making a little too much money, and by the end, that same agricultural industry in the late 80s, mid-80s, started these big government factories of raising fish and things like that, trying to kind of corner the market and maybe make some more money for the state. Now, by 1989, there was the Velvet Revolution, and this really happened when it was a peaceful end to communism, and the wall fell. The Berlin Wall ended soon after, and it was really a time where people could start accessing things. It was a little bit of a chaotic time. The country was depressed. It has a 40% lower cost of living still into the 2000s than the rest of Europe because of the lack of the capitalism involved. Now, I'm not saying that capitalism versus communism, I'm not going to go there. I'm just saying that this country had to jump into the capitalist system from a communist system, and some people involved in that husbandry of fish on a larger scale also got involved in the import-export business. A lot of time military people were assigned that, but they're not really doing a military task. It's just state-sponsored, as you will. So the wall comes down, and by 1993 it was reported that 1,539 species had been brought back into the Czech Republic and were being sold, at least on paper. And so that was a quick explosion, and soon hereafter, people started forming collectives and cooperatives, and they're really well known for this, where they would get together, use the equipment that they had, build the equipment if they needed it. All sorts of interesting articles come out of this era of the early 90s where people, and 80s, but it wasn't coming out yet, but people would get together in their neighborhood and they would specialize in a couple fish and they would breed just beautiful versions of them. And they would then trade that for money to fish exporters. They would trade that for Western goods when it was still kind of trickling in. And then family members moving from Czechoslovakia, finally able to travel, people who love fish, are able to bring back even more fish, make ties to Amazonian species and things that weren't in the hobby by the 50s and 60s. There's a great history of Czechoslovakian fish keeping that I was told to mention by my new friend Peter. I had talked in my first video a little differently about Czechoslovakia and a little more harsh, and that was because my friend that I spoke with, his family was at odds with the Communist Party, and so he had a father who was disappeared or executed or thrown in jail, we don't know, and also his experience was a family working in more rural conditions in a blockhouse, drab, and him and his friends were into getting Western stuff into the country from the frontier, and they ran into trouble, and you could get like 5 years in prison for having, you know, Beatles records or whatever, if it wasn't through the state-sponsored import shops that really censored what was going on. So they left the country and informed me, looking back from a 1970s point of view, of the harsh times during the Soviets. But it has changed quite a bit. Pardon my other fish channels. I've got to subscribe to all y'all, show you love. So in here we've got a map or a pie chart, and you can see that Singapore with 69 million US dollars coming in fish, Japan 41 million, and the Czech Republic with 32 million. I checked more recently and it looks like it's jumped up to about 38 million. Plecos being one of the big sources, and Epistogramme agassiziis, things like that. Specialty fish are coming in, and they have the know-how because of these co-ops and collectives that they shared information, and they did it as a hobby, but they also did it to get by. And when you do things like that, you get good at it. And so that is one reason there are a lot of Czech fish hobbyists and enthusiasts. Now the number has begun to dwindle. It's not everybody growing it in their apartment. Like, every apartment complex doesn't have like a fish club or anything, and not that it did, but a lot did. You know, there were 16, or let's see, there were 3,800 at one point by the 80s, and now there's about 1,600 registered fish breeders. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot more hobbyists and things, but it has become more corporatized. So a lot of times these breeders will specialize in something beautiful, like these jeweled green corridoras or green laser corridoras, things like that. These beautiful gourmet and paradise fish, all Czechoslovakian varieties that have come out of there, and killifish. So it is the Killi forum on Facebook that I first linked up with some people currently living in Czechoslovakia, and I hope I'm putting out a video that they can be more happy with, because I got some things wrong. I said that, you know, dogs were too much of a luxury and that people were hungry. They were telling me that people weren't starving to death, it's just that they had bland food or rations, and if you wanted that special food, you had to have an inn and some sort of, whether it was repairing cars or whatever it might be, you'd be on a waiting list to buy new things. And so if you could grow something and trade something, barter something, it was a way to get ahead. Even if you weren't a member of the Communist Party and kind of at the front of the line for that stuff. Also, this is a really small picture, sorry, I will enlarge it, but beautiful tetras. Like, I've never seen these in the US, but somehow they have grown these, and they have all sorts of albino varieties and pleco varieties that we don't have here, and so we're seeing it as a novelty, whereas maybe in Europe or the Balkans or the Middle East, they've had access via this trade for a while. The US has not. We have our own breeders, and then we buy from Asia predominantly and import from South America. So these later strains that are specialty ones, just beautiful, some of them, we don't see as much. Now, as time goes on, people are also getting into aquascaping, and so aquaculture and plants is becoming larger there. It's becoming larger everywhere, but that's becoming, that's encouraging the microfish trade and specializing. Hopefully they can get more money for the microfish trade. Now, they're competing right now with modern day Southeast Asia and Singapore. Interesting fact, you know. So, brief interruption, pardon this announcement. My camera rig fell apart, and I want you guys to know, one, that this channel is operating on a budget. So, I had used a camera tripod for a film camera, and a bungee cord to strap my phone, which I'm currently holding, to it. Then what I did was I used a bungee cord to wrap that around the phone and a wrench. Now, this is where things got bad. So, if you take a look at me, the bungee cord snapped off the rig, and they put these little protection things on the bungee cords, but they are not, I don't know if that's in focus, they don't stay on. So this little piece hooked me by the face as it came whipping off. So I just wanted you guys to know, while I go clean this up and we take a brief break, I care about you guys, and any contributions to the page, whether that's a thumbs up if you've learned something and like this, or whether that is sharing a link or sharing your experiences, or whether that's visiting my Patreon page so I can afford a decent camera and tripod, would be much appreciated, because I'm putting my blood, sweat, and hopefully no tears yet, but into this channel, and we'll get back to finishing up talking about the Czech Republic in one moment. Sorry about this, guys. As I was saying, so it's hard for them to compete with the ever-changing world. Southeast Asia has free food, electricity, in the sense that they don't need to pay for heat. It's hot there. They don't need to warm their ponds. They've got rivers and things that they can divert. They've already got rice paddies, which convert really easily into fish ponds, or even both, fish ponds and rice paddies at the same time. And, you know, it's hard to compete with that. So the Czech fish growers will be breeders and masters of aquaculture. I'm sure we'll be coming up to date with beautiful stuff like this, fish that go into scenes like this. You know, they have a long history of lots of work with terrariums and plants and fish, and so I'm sure we'll see lots in the future from them. We'll see lots of pretty epistos. They'll keep coming in, and I recommend, if you have a choice, if you can ask, buy Czech, you know, as opposed to Thai. Like, it's not to, or Indonesian or whatnot. You know, the Japanese, Singapore, and the Czech really do take good care of their fish. They care about them, they have a passion for breeding, and they do things with no half steps. So this was a brief history on the Czech fish industry and why Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic became this landlocked European hub of amazing fish, both fresh and saltwater. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If I got something wrong, comment. I'd love to hear about it. I'm not trying to push any agenda here. I'm just trying to get history and an interesting story out to you guys, because I was curious why all these awesome fish coming in from the Czech Republic and strains that I never see anywhere else. And it's because of the hard work and ingenuity of the Czech people for over 100 years of raising fish. So if you like this, if you've enjoyed this video, other videos, if you like what's going on in my other tanks and the experiments we have going with the new microscope and talking about the history and origin of who discovered plants, why they're named what they're named, fish and who bred them, all sorts of things like that. If you want to support me, because I've put my blood and sweat into this, because I bungee corded my phone, that's why there was this weird break. People have been saying, Alex, get a tripod. I know, I got a tripod, and then I got a bungee cord, and then I bungee corded my friggin' phone to the thing with a wrench and a bungee cord, trying to be innovative like the Czech people are, and instead this little piece came whipping around, grabbed my nose, and it has been bleeding now. I took a half-hour intermission. So, if you've enjoyed what you've seen here, if you've learned something, please support the channel. Like, thumbs up, correct me in the comments if I got anything wrong. I'd love to hear from the Czech people. I know you guys are awesome, sweet, loving, smart people. And yeah, so consider subscribing, consider pressing the thumbs up if you like this video. I know it's a long format. And also, if you want to help me get things like an actual tripod, or maybe a camera instead of my phone, or a macro lens so that we can use the microscope a little better, consider visiting my Patreon page. We've got lots of great rewards and limited edition, limited access, exclusives on there for people who want to support the channel. Then we can cut out the ads on the other end of things. I'm not pushing anything that I have here. I don't have a product to sell per se, other than my self-knowledge and the love of science and building a community with you guys. So thanks for staying tuned. I hope you learned a little bit about the Czech fish, the history of the Czech fish hobby and trade, and I'll talk to you guys next time. This has been Alexander Williamson with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Thanks, guys. Take it easy. Bye.